Now I would like to invite our next esteemed speaker, Professor Wendy Singer. Professor Wendy Singer is the Roy Wortman Professor, History and Director of Asian and Middle East Studies at Kenyon College in the United States. She teaches modern Indian history. Her books include A Constituency Suitable for Ladies, A Social History of Women and Elections, and Independent India, which tells history through literature, art, politics, and social movements. Her earlier work was on oral narratives and rural politics in Bihar in the 1930s, as reflected in Creating Histories, oral narratives, and the politics of history making. It was for this project that Professor Singer first encountered the Proscribed Pamphlets collection at the British Library and began to see the importance of interactions between oral and written sources. All of these projects share a deep interest in the history of Indian democracy, even especially as it challenged the British colonial state. She has followed this inquiry to Chennai to study the long history of the Madras Municipal Council. Some of this recent comparative research between Bihar and Madras has appeared in the journal South Asia, the Election Law Journal, and in several edited volumes. We welcome you, Professor Wendy Singer. Thank you for joining us. Over to you now.
Thank you so much. Can I share screen?
Yes, ma'am. Please go ahead.
Share a window. Yeah. Oh, there it is. Well, thank you, everyone. And I want to thank the organizers of this conference. This is such an important conversation to be having. I've already appreciated the keynotes and comments that came before. And I've had a long conversation over many years with Shahid Amin, and you'll hear some commonalities between some of the issues that he raised as I go on. On a light note, it is now 1:30 a.m. Where I am, so it's still dark outside. And in that darkness, it's nice to have the enlightenment of these conversations about prescribed pamphlets and banned material. The basis of my talk today is a particular collection of banned material that's made up of song lyrics, flyers, and pamphlets from the early 20th century. I will address the ironies of trying to ban material that was oral.
Excuse me, ma'am. Quite disturbed. Voice is coming. No, you're.
Should I? Is there? Can you hear me?
Please. Yeah, Professor Wendy, continue, please.
Yeah. Okay. Just wanted to make sure that there wasn't a problem. Okay. Thanks. Let's see where, yes. So I want to talk about these prescribed pamphlets, especially as they relate to oral narratives that I collected also at about the same time that I first encountered these. And actually one of the main issues that I want to address is that more people should be using these materials. Some of them are at the British Library, others in the National Archive. And yes, they're in many languages, and some of the languages are ones I don't know. And so it would be wonderful to have more commentary on the Telugu and Malayali and other materials. So let me turn to some specific examples of ways in which I found these powerful materials. And I'm going to start with one of them, which was a pamphlet that I saw many years ago called The Autobiography of Kadi. It's a 1922 compilation of political songs and commentary from Bihar. A singer both calls upon and mocks Le Chailaba, which is in Bihari Hindi, a young man, but usually a kind-hearted young man. The singer also in this song shifts gender as the song progresses. But central to the song is a lesson about the importance of Kadi as a political symbol of Indian nationalism. A part of the song goes, the Videshi writes, Remember me and forget me not, Re Chalaba. Still you don't understand. The beautiful foreign sari brings you curses. Wearing foreign pants, claiming a national, and yet claiming a nationalist heart. Foreign goods are shameful, like a prostitute or Wendy. Hear Gandhi Baba's call, Re Chalaba. This Hindi Maithili songbook, and the songs were both in Hindi and Maithili in this case. This one was labeled HINB 763 in the British Library's collection. And it's literally a compilation made up of bits and pieces drawn together in various order. One interesting thing in this song is the way in which it addresses its target of the narrative in ways as the poem goes along, sometimes coaxing and sometimes chastising. This songbook is one of many similar documents I photocopied in the British Library in 1985 and 1986, when I was first studying the peasant movements in India and Bihar in the 1920s and 30s. It is an ideal example of the kinds of publications that emerged in rural Bihar at the time. Small towns developed printing presses that produced not only nationalist literature, but religious tracts, autobiographies, family histories, and flyers that were distributed in order to call people to meetings. One local activist described it this way. So even though these pamphlets were banned, that didn't stop their production. As one activist explained it, we snuck into fields of sugarcane when the sugarcane was high with a mimeograph machine and produced material at night with just the light of the moon, or when we thought no one was able to see us, we used a lantern. In this essay, I examined the important British Library's collection known as Proscribed Pamphlets to discuss their value in rethinking sources of history making. Copies of these are also available in the National Archive, some of the same pamphlets I saw later on in Delhi. With time to reflect on this material long after I first encountered it, I see its significance in three specific ways. First of all, especially since much of this material is made up of songbooks and poems, it allows us to talk about the relationship between oral and written sources of the past. Secondly, it sheds a different light on political resistance movements, showing what forms of political material the British government considered important enough to ban, and what movements seemed a particular threat to the British. And finally, a collection that contains material in multiple languages opens up important possibilities for comparing what would usually be considered local history across geographic regions of India. And so since I've been studying Tamil, I've begun to be able to make some comparisons. Rethinking research I began in 1986. This paper shows the multi-directional flow and ongoing translation of oral and written sources, which both served as forms of protest and as sources of history. Often common themes ran through these materials that reveal what rhetoric of political resistance was most resonant across time and space. One example I will use here today is this idea of shamefulness that ran through a number of these songs and pamphlets. And I think that, and I'm just going to use that as one example as a way to dive in more deeply to this material. Encountering proscribed pamphlets. In the mid-1980s, I collected songs of political resistance from written sources like the autobiography of Kadi, and from people who sang them for me in villages in Bihar. At the time, I was writing a dissertation on peasant movements in the region of Mithila in North Bihar. In the process, I both worked in archives in Darbhanga, Patna, and Delhi, and collected a range of oral material. I learned many songs by heart and continued to talk to people about their content and their uses and the mechanisms through which they were transmitted. Interestingly, this particular song did not make it into my dissertation or my first book, Creating Histories. This shows, however, how much rich material there was, that not everything could be included. One critical issue that I discovered in the course of this research was how different kinds of songs were associated with different political movements in the countryside. the archive placed them in categories based on languages, but I found it more important to disaggregate them based on the movements they represented. Some songs clearly were generated by peasant and labor movements. These often had socialist and communist influences about the Red Revolution or Workers United. Others were associated with the freedom movement more generally and focused on nationalism. Later songs addressed the Maithili language movement, advocating that Maithil be added to the 8th schedule of India's constitution. When I found songs in written pamphlets from the British Library, like other written sources, I took them along to Bihar to ask people about them. In this group, the songs that resonated most with women I interviewed were songs about khadi and the social reform movement. Women's participation in spinning khadi thread and picketing foreign cloth stores were resonant in this song as an example. What is remarkable about the collection of prescribed materials in the British Library is the breadth of the sources, genre, and languages represented. At about the same time I reached the India Office Library and Record Room, these materials were being cataloged by Graham Shaw and Mary Lloyd, who were among the archivists that had published an article and bibliography of these materials. The collection contains more than 1,600 documents, including everything from small books to single-page leaflets, and they included at least 15 South Asian languages. The pamphlets were cataloged and labeled by those languages. However, material in regional languages like Maithili were often incorporated in the Hindi list. What is remarkable about the collection is its breadth. The government banned materials mostly based on the Indian Press Act of 1910, which singled out as seditious anything that showed antagonism to the British government, and also banned items that they perceived might fuel religious strife. But many of the songs and pamphlets from peasant movements were not included in these materials. So I found a lot of pamphlets in the countryside even still that people had kept that were very radical, but not included in these banned materials. A large part of the collection contained nationalist poetry, and we heard some of that earlier. This reflected both the increase in circulation of such materials after World War I and the non-cooperation movement. The Bihar pamphlets I collected mostly fit into that category. Since I was already interested in songs before I came to the India Office Library in 1985, my first surprise upon seeing the written record was how similar the material was to songs I'd already heard. An important lesson then was that banning songbooks, of course, did not stop the circulation of songs themselves, that oral material continues to be sung and shared. And when I took the songbooks back to the countryside, people recognized many of those same songs. And so while the songbooks sometimes had an author attached to them, people didn't necessarily attribute them to anybody in particular. Indeed, this is an irony about the longevity of ephemeral material. Though produced on flimsy paper and in small batches not meant to last, their content indeed survived. Pamphlets confiscated by the colonial government lived on in public record, and the songs themselves were preserved in private lives. But many of those people are no longer alive to sing those songs. So having this written record enriches our historical, here are some of those pamphlets, but enriches our historical evidence. And I show this as an example from the same region, but a lot of ephemeral material is still being produced. And here's a Madhubani painting that's from a protest against dowry. So all of these materials fit into a larger world of ephemeral political work. So now let me look at some very specific examples and talk about the ways in which these materials worked. The songs that appeared in the archives often came from the Khadi movement. And Khadi centers were surely sites of sedition. People understood what they were doing as nationalism. At the same time, Khadi production became part of the rural economy, from women spinners to young boys who collected the thread and took them to male weavers at these central locations. And as they worked, either the spinners or the weavers, they surely sang songs that were sometimes songs of protest, but were part of their daily rituals. Some were jumar, some were ghazals, some were bhajans, and these became mixed together as new words were put to them in different contexts. Let me talk a little bit about the sad story of Khadi, which is another pamphlet in addition to the autobiography of Khadi. So yes, a lot of these were about Khadi. It seemed that the Khadi movement, I think because of Gandhi's connection to it, was one of the preoccupations for the British to ban those particular songs. In the Ray Chalaba song, as you go through the song, I can go back to it actually, you can see that the person being addressed changes in gender. So the kind-hearted bystander is accused of wearing ostentatious saris in one line and foreign trousers in another. Such pamphlets and poems, and the poems they contained, were part of a conscious creation of written record, happening on the spot of local political expression. They also served as a means of organizing. People passed pamphlets around from one village to another. This one has an author on the first page, Brinda Prasad Varma, also called Prem. His pen name is repeated in several poems, including a ghazal at the end of the booklet. The site of publication listed on the pamphlet is Darbhanga town in North Bihar. Darbhanga was designated as the district in colonial Bihar. It was also a market town and the headquarters of the zamindari of the Maharaja of Darbhanga. The Maharaja had his residence there, and the town expanded considerably from 1919 to 1935 when many of these pamphlets were being produced. Some of the parts of this Ray Chalaba poem also resonated with songs that people sang that were not directly this song. This Jumar is also given a little preface criticizing the nature of imperialism and the imperial system. And this little preface says, depending on someone brings destruction. It will cut at the basis of our lives. Then what follows are 8 couplets, each ending in Ray Chalaba. So there's also a kind of nod to a ghazal, even though it doesn't quite fit into that pattern. The theme of shamefulness of foreign cloth resonated with other songs of the time. For example, when I asked women to sing Khadi songs for me, they often included a reference to morality. For example, another song goes like this, and this definitely reminded me of something that Shahid Amin said. I will not wear foreign cloth, the words of my darling call out. I will fight rather than give in. Because wearing such a thing in the Ganges to bathe, when I emerge from the Ganges, my body will show shamefully. I heard this song originally in Maithili in North Bihar, but I talked to people who knew other versions of it in Magahi and South Bihar as well. In this way, songs traveled. And interestingly, the Ganges flows through central Bihar, and so it had perhaps more literal resonance when sung there. Like Ray Chalaba, the Ganges song also has an interesting gender complexity. Although I heard it from women who described it as a women's singing, a spinning song, the narrator is a man who sang the words of my darling or my sweetheart, implying a woman, call out. Of course, people often sing the parts of others in folk songs, so this is not necessarily unusual. But in this case, the gender inversion coincided with the practices of the Khadi movement, in which women did take on male roles in protests, and men took on women's roles in spinning. Some upper class and upper caste women described political marches as the first time they'd gone out into the streets, marching and singing for social and political reform. This was clear in one of the very important aspects of the khadi movement, not only making their own cloth, but picketing foreign cloth stores and often at the same time liquor stores. So that was a way in which women found a kind of freedom of movement that was being encouraged by nationalism. But the local nature of songs tied to regional languages did not mean that political activism was localized. Rather, similar actions took place across India in ways that were expressed in local idioms. For example, in 1932, women marching against foreign cloth store in Madras were sprayed with water hoses as the police tried to quell dissent in 1932. The commonality between these protests and similar events in North India are obvious. Like the Bihari examples, the Madras story is a local one. It came to light in the Madras Municipal Council meeting when council members took on the Commissioner of Police and the Commissioner of the Madras Municipal Corporation. The issue of contention was that the police had stolen a water van that was owned by the corporation. And Indians who were in charge of the corporation said that this was an illegal use of the water van. What is strikingly similar to the language in the khadi songs collected from Bihar are the connection between foreign cloth, women's workers, and the morality of issue of attached to water. Here, the river, not the Ganges, but the Kovam, is cited as a symbol of pollution and defilement. The Madras incident highlighted the idea that the police may have used dirty water to defile women protesters. What water is this? A counselor asks. And another one says, are they using colored water or drainage water? Hanan Angelo, the only woman in the council, then responded, may I know if they're using filtered water or the polluted water from the Kovam River? So in this way, they are echoing some of the same narratives that exist in those spinning songs. The immoral actions of the government, the aggression of the police, and the government's violation of its own rules of separate powers for Indians became expressed in these same terms of shamefulness. The continuum of the khadi movement was spinning, which women could even do at home, to khadi, and then that same thread was sent to khadi centers, connecting women's work to men's work in the same political movements. In oral narratives, the khadi movement was often described as part of a larger social reform movement and often associated with a kind of conservative politics in the countryside, as opposed to more radical labor organizing or peasant movements. And so it is ironic that these were the ones that the British thought of as the greater threat, and certainly for banning. The Ray Chalaba song makes explicit references to British rule and colonialism as part of its own moral lesson. The Videshi foreigner writes, remember me, forget me not, and hurled curses at us and take our wealth. Other songs were more pointed in their bitter and threatening language. While Ray Chalaba was a kind of light feel and reference to setting it to a jhumar, to dance music, underscores the lightness of that song. By contrast, a more haunting song from another proscribed pamphlet powerfully invokes the colonial inequality. This pamphlet, titled ironically or intentionally, Beloved Songs of the Countryside. And I thought this was interesting in reference to what some of the titles that Shahid was talking about that were more subversive. But this pamphlet was called Beloved Songs of the Countryside. And one of them was about what imperialism meant in very powerful terms. Oh, Ram, I don't like the flute of these white people. They take our rice, they take our air, they take our cotton, and what do they give us? 2 metal needles. They take away the gold, they take away the silver, they take away every paisa, and what do they give? A single piece of tin. They take away each female goat, they take away each male goat, they take away all the eggs, and in exchange, what do they give? A flag made of paper. This song gives prominence to the inequality of economics of imperialism. Indians provide cotton, gold, and silver while receiving goods of much less value. The final image of the paper janda, kagas ka ek janda, presents multiple metaphors. The flag is of paper might indicate the bankruptcy of imperialism, propelling nationalists toward a flag of independence. Or it could mean that the British had provided only flags of empire, not the protection wealth it promised. And in this particular pamphlet, you see the flags and with the charkha on it and Mother India. So perhaps the replacement of the charkha flag for the paper flag that the British are promising. Finally, the Ray Chalaba song also offers our kind-hearted but unmindful young man some redemption through khadi. It ends, but wearing khadi will reform us, Ray Chalaba. Hear Gandhi Baba's call, Ray Chalaba. Stop wearing foreign pants and claiming a nationalist heart. Through tears of love, we see our country now. So let me conclude. What these examples show is how the Proscribed Pamphlets collection bridged a gap between oral history and written sources. Recording songs and producing flyers was itself an act of politics, providing something to share and publicize protests. And this was not lost on British officials who readily banned the material evidence of organizing. What the study of the Khadi movement in Bihar shows is that banning oral material did not destroy it. The written documents of Khadi songs did enhance the study of the songs themselves. And as we as historians can collect material that was once banned, we can add it to oral evidence and other evidence from the countryside to get a more pointed example of local history. A movement that was especially important to women did not often produce arrests, did not readily produce written records of its own, court records, police files, etc. Interestingly, although the Khadi pamphlets in the archives were often recorded by men and written by men, as Shahid pointed out, the songs that contained in them were very often women's songs. It was the combination of oral sources on the ground and oral sources in the archive that best elaborate the significance of the Khadi movement for reasons that were not necessarily nationalism. Also for women's ability to get out of the house, to become part of a larger process, to gain some. In fact, women spinners also could make some money from their spinning. A lot of widows were spinners during the nationalist movement. A comparison across regions suggested here is just one way in which the Proscribed Pamphlets allow us to do a kind of history that local history alone can't tell us. It also hints at another larger conclusion. By banning certain kinds of rhetoric, we see what the British government saw as a threat. The Khadi songs were one of those threats, showing the power not only of the movement, but of how it was transmitted through song. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Singer. Thank you so much for taking us through the journey of data collection through this project and introducing us to the available sources, and also for pointing out the importance and longevity of oral sources when it comes to studying the history of colonial India from we popularly call as Worm's view perspective. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank
you. Since we are on a very tight schedule, I would like to ask Ravi sir, do we have time for Q&A or should I call upon our next?
I think there should be some questions. Please open the floor.
Okay, so I'm opening the floor. If there are any questions, we'll quickly take 2-3 questions and then move ahead with the next speaker. So are there any questions?
Okay, let me, Professor Singer, thank you so much. It flows nicely from Shahid's address earlier. And what is remarkable from our point of view is that your observation that, banning does not mean destruction of the material. It lives on in memory and performance. and it lives on also in the autobiographies of, I was reading something like a text written by Yashpal, who was one of the revolutionaries with Bhagat Singh and others, and he mentions there are several plays that HSRA and this group actually plays around Mahabharat, that they actually remodeled and rewrote. The plays of Parsi theatre, for example, from Parsi theatre, that they rewrote and actually performed. So it's a wonderful journey, and there's no one-way journey that from oral it goes to print. Rather, it can go on from print to the oral, and there are various slippages. This cat and mouse game between the between colonial control and the nationalist subversion, as it were. I was curious about this, the original title of Atmakatha, Khadi ki Atmakatha. Is it called Atmakatha, autobiography, or something else?
No, it is called Atmakatha. And there was also another one that was called The Sad Story of Khadi. And I mean, there are numbers of them, but that particular pamphlet, which I happen to have right here on my desk, it was called Atmakatha.
Right. The other thing is, your talk
and what's
tells
useful
us,
about that is that that's
a remarkable thing is that there are limits to colonial control, right? Not everything could be actually banned and or proscribed or even snatched away. So there are limits. You could not reach out to every subversive act of print or performance. So that's another. Thanks a lot. One would like to read you more and about these forms of ghazals and bhajans and qawwalis. But very nice to know this is the first paper I have heard about proscription, about proscribed literature performance in Bihar, in Midlanchal, etc., etc. Some of us do belong there. So thanks a lot for your wonderful paper.
I just wanted to say one more thing, and that is the circulation of these is critical. That Khadi was considered dangerous and prescribed, but the circulation of this material went way beyond just Khadi songs.
Any other questions?
Ravikant?
Chat box. Aparna Vaidik writes,
yeah,
and this is for Amin Sahab. We have not done any Q&A, but I mean, we can discuss it. Professor Singer can come on this. And Shahid, if you are still there,
I've come
you
to
say that the pamphlets were produced by upper caste men who may not have been well versed in Hindi, and that these pamphlets were casteist and sexist. Would they have been less so if the men were upper class and well educated?
Hey, that's a very, very fine distinction that is best left to politicians, non-academics. Obviously it was a way of saying that these are not your, they are very, very well-known poets. The poetry is not, all that great. That's what I meant. I'm not saying that if there was somebody with a PhD degree in casteist and sexist, he would have written a better poetry. No, that was not, it's just that it's a reading based on a large survey of the material. But what I was trying to do is point out that very often these are taken as examples of nationalist outpouring, without actually flagging, not necessarily in terms of the name, and parentage of one who wrote, but in the discursive world, that it shows. So perhaps you might have the rare example of somebody who was not casteist, still writing in a particular way. And I'm not saying that everything flows from your subject position, but I was trying to suggest that it's very difficult not to be struck by the constant manner in which fissures and attitudes within North Indian society, surface quite prominently in something that's supposed to be broadly ideological, which is supposed to subsume differences within a broad emerging nationalist public. So, Aparna, that's what I was trying to argue, because normally and I'm so glad that Wendy is here, and we have been in conversation now for a very, very long time. Though I don't come from Bihar, Ravikant, but I'm on the cusp of Bihar. After me, Bihar, as they say. But
you can be an honorary Bihari.
Sure. After me, Bihar. Sorry. So, oh my God. So what I'm trying to say is that if normally, even we looked at this material as evidence, to tag on to what we learned from Home Political File or a CID report. I was trying to, just as a preliminary exercise, try to, look at it not more than as evidence of so many pamphlets being written on Khadi, right? That our nationalist outpouring was so great, and that the colonial state was, Wendy suggested that, and that's true, was very, especially on the lookout for Khadi. Though, Wendy, I'm not too sure that there was this kind of a nationalist ire, shall we say, directed at Khadi, because it didn't really, it in some ways was not considered that political from people in authority. Though while it was construed as very innovative, and the language of Khadi and Charkha really permeated in wide areas. In my Gandhi piece, I do refer to people, which castes punished delinquents by ordering them to get so many charkhas fabricated. So there is a way in which charkha is a language that permeates more so within a growing nationalist public than something that the colonial state is really concerned to ban the moment it comes through. The fact that there is so much of banned material to do with charkha is also because so much of stuff was banned, and also because I have a feeling that a lot of these poems were not single title poems. They would be part of a Sangeet Mala or something, and we are able to pick it up, the Khadi poems. But that's a point that worth considering, that it's very difficult to establish that unless there is a noting in a record that perhaps in a collection of poems it was one particularly offensive quote unquote poem that led to the entire collection being proscribed and therefore available to Wendy and me at the British Library and the National Archives. So that I think it would, those of us who are now more concerned to look at this textually rather than only at evidentiary.
Yeah, I agree.
So that if you look at the earlier work of some of my colleagues, say Gyan Pandey even, right? So the 1930s, this is evidence that you pick up, which it is a bit evidence, of course, but it also allows you to tell a story which is about Indian society more generally. And so to that extent, meaning I've not established that person to person by caste names and so on, it is a fair assumption to say that these are not really low caste, newly literate people writing. Perhaps there are some of them. And one last thing, Wendy, is that it's also interesting that some of these songs are actually written by people who sign themselves as Khajadiwala. I mean, somebody who plays, the Khajadi. And as you know, this kind of a single-handed drum does emerge as a sign of resistance in a lot of popular movements today. It's not simple people simple singing, but to the beat of the country, so that there are people who are writing it for it to be sung. So thank you, Aparna. That made me think a bit more about it. But my basic point was that this is an archive that can be explored in all sorts of ways. So nationalism, the nationalist rubric doesn't kind of lead to a closure in how we read it.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd want to add to that is that you're absolutely right that but whose name is on the pamphlet might not have been necessarily who wrote the song or who sang the song or who produced the song or who made it up. So you're right that the archive tells us one thing, but the songs may be from other places.
But there's also the issue of printing. In fact, one of the pamphlets that I was going to put up is actually stressing its copyright. That इज्जत को समझ के, मान को समझ के इसको copy करना. So that there is a way in which print, the fact that it's been printed, also leads to it really following in some ways the notion of copyright.
I agree, and also a kind of prestige that you got it printed.
Sorry, I think we'll just stop. We've been talking too much to each other. But thank you, Aparna.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Shahid. Thank you, Professor Singer. And we actually very much enjoyed the further delving into the ideas that were earlier discussed. Thank you so much.